On the morning of June 18, 2026, black smoke rose over Moscow. Ukrainian drones, nearly 200 of them, slipped past Russian air defenses and struck the Kapotnya oil refinery, just 10 miles from the Kremlin. It was the largest attack on the Russian capital since the war began. Apartment buildings burned. Airports shut down. A shopping mall went up in flames. For Vladimir Putin, this was not just a military setback. It was the failure of a 30-year project. A project to reverse what he once called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. To understand June 18th, 2026, you have to go back to June 1st, 2025. On that day, the Security Service of Ukraine launched what Russian military bloggers would call their own Pearl Harbor. They named it Operation Pavutina, Operation Spiderweb. For 18 months, Ukrainian intelligence had smuggled 117 first-person view drones into Russia, hidden inside the roofs of prefabricated cabins on the backs of ordinary trucks. Russian civilian truckers, paid for what they thought was a routine job, drove the explosives across the country without knowing. At 1 p.m. Moscow time, the roofs slid open. The drones launched simultaneously against 5 air bases: Belaya, Dyagilevo, Ivanovo-Severny, Olenia, and Ukrainka, across 5 time zones. The furthest was Belaya, in eastern Siberia, more than 4,300 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The strikes destroyed or damaged 41 Russian aircraft, 295 and 222 M3 strategic bombers, F-50 airborne radar planes, aircraft that had been out of production for decades, aircraft Russia could not replace. $7 billion of damage, inflicted at a cost of roughly $2,000 per drone. But the deeper damage was conceptual. For 70 years, Russian strategic doctrine had rested on a single word: glubina, depth. The vast distances of the country were its shield. Spiderweb proved that depth no longer mattered. The Russian shield had a hole in it, and the hole was the size of a truck. In April 2005, 6 years into his first decade in power, Vladimir Putin stood before the Federal Assembly and delivered a sentence that would define everything that came after. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This was not nostalgia. It was a mission statement. Over the next 20 years, Putin's foreign policy worked methodically toward reversing that catastrophe. The 2008 war in Georgia, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the proxy war in the Donbass, the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, justified by an essay Putin himself authored, arguing that Russians and Ukrainians were one people. The pattern was consistent: rebuild the empire that had dissolved in December 1991. Restore Russia as the dominant power across what Russians call the Blizhneye Zarubezhye, the near abroad. Recover the strategic depth, the buffer states, the industrial base, the populations, the seas that had defined the Soviet Union at its height. But to understand why this project was doomed from the start, and why drones smuggled in trucks could humiliate the Russian capital in 2026, you have to understand what actually broke the Soviet Union, because it did not collapse in a single day. It collapsed across a decade. And the turning points are not what most people remember. The Soviet Union did not die because Ronald Reagan called it an evil empire. It died from contradictions that had been accumulating since the 1970s. Turning point 1, 1979. The Politburo, led by an aging Leonid Brezhnev, invaded Afghanistan. What was meant to be a brief stabilization mission became a 9-year quagmire, the Soviet Vietnam. 15,000 Soviet soldiers killed, trillions of rubles spent, and the spectacle of the Red Army, the army that had taken Berlin, unable to defeat tribal fighters, armed by the C-1A. Turning point 2, 1985. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, 54 years old, the youngest member of the Politburo, was elected General Secretary. He inherited an economy growing at less than 1% a year, a military bleeding in Afghanistan, and a centralized planning system that could not produce enough toilet paper. He launched 2 reforms: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Both were intended to save the system. Both would help destroy it. Turning point 3, April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded in northern Ukrainian USSR. The Soviet state lied. It evacuated nobody for 36 hours. When the lie became impossible to sustain, Soviet citizens learned, for the first time in their adult lives, that the state would tell them their children were safe while radiation poisoned them. Trust in the system, already low, never recovered. Turning point 4, November 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, did not send tanks. The Brezhnev Doctrine, the promise to defend communist regimes in Eastern Europe with force, was dead. Over the next year, every Warsaw Pact government collapsed. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany itself. Turning point 5, 1990. Inside the USSR, the parade of sovereignties began. Lithuania declared independence in March. Russia itself, under a new figure named Boris Yeltsin, declared its sovereignty in June. By the end of the year, every one of the 15 Soviet republics had declared some form of independence or autonomy. The empire that had ruled from Berlin to Vladivostok was no longer ruling its own provinces. By August 1991, hardliners in the Politburo had decided that Gorbachev was destroying the country. He was preparing to sign a new union treaty on August 20th, a document that would have transformed the USSR into a loose confederation, transferring real power to the republics. On August 18th, Gorbachev was on vacation in Foros, Crimea. A delegation arrived from Moscow. They told him he was sick and would be replaced. He refused to sign the emergency decree. They cut his communications and placed him under house arrest. On the morning of August 19th, Soviet television announced that Vice President Gennady Yanayev had assumed power, citing Gorbachev's inability to perform his duties due to health reasons. A junta calling itself the GKCHP, the State Committee on the State of Emergency, was now in charge. Among them, KGB Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov. Tanks rolled into Moscow. But the coup, intended to save the Soviet Union, would kill it within 72 hours. Yanayev's hand shook visibly during his press conference. Broadcast across the country, the image undermined every claim to authority. At the Russian White House, the building of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank and read a statement calling the coup illegal. Soldiers refused to fire on civilians. Tens of thousands gathered to defend the building. By August 21st, the coup had collapsed. Yanayev was arrested. Pavlov suffered a stroke. Defense Minister Yazov wept and asked Gorbachev for forgiveness. Gorbachev flew back to Moscow. But the country he returned to was no longer his. The center had failed. Real power now belonged to Yeltsin and to the republics who saw their chance. On December 8, 1991, 3 men met at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest, on the border between Belarus and Poland. Boris Yeltsin, representing Russia, Leonid Kravchuk, representing Ukraine, Stanislav Shushkevich, representing Belarus. They signed an agreement of fewer than 2,000 words. It declared that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as a subject of international law, had ceased to exist. They informed President George H.W. Bush before they informed Mikhail Gorbachev. On December 21st, 11 of the 12 remaining Soviet republics met in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, and ratified the Belovezha Accords. The USSR was over by signature. What remained was ceremony. On December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev gave his resignation speech on Soviet television. He spoke for 12 minutes. He defended his reforms. He warned against authoritarianism. He signed the decree transferring control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, over 27,000 warheads, to Boris Yeltsin. At 7:32 p.m. Moscow time, the Soviet flag, red with the hammer and sickle and red star, was lowered over the Kremlin Senate building. It was not formally folded. It was simply taken down. The Russian tricolor was raised in its place. Most Muscovites did not notice. Most of the world found out the next morning. The empire that had defined the 20th century, that had defeated Hitler, that had launched the first satellite, the first man into space, that had threatened mutually assured destruction for 40 years, ended without a parade, without a battle, without a single shot fired at its capital. Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000 believing he could reverse this, that the dissolution was a wound, not a death, that with enough patience, enough force, enough will, the geography could be reassembled. But what 2025 and 2026 have revealed is something Putin's project cannot answer. The Soviet Union's collapse was not just political, it was technological. The system that broke in 1991 had been built on the assumption that vast geography, heavy industry, centralized command, and strategic depth would always favor the strong. That power flowed from steel and territory. Operation Spiderweb in 2025 and the Moscow strikes in 2026 proved the opposite. A few $100,000 of drones, smuggled in trucks, can destroy billion-dollar bombers across 5 time zones. Strategic depth is no longer a shield. The Kremlin's enemies no longer need armies to reach Moscow. The empire Putin spent 25 years trying to rebuild was already obsolete when he started. Not because the West defeated it, but because the world that made it powerful no longer exists. The Soviet flag came down at 7:32 p.m. on December 25, 1991. In June 2026, smoke rose 10 miles from the Kremlin. The empire will not return. Even Putin now may finally be beginning to understand why.